Good afternoon. This webinar will be recorded. Today's presentation will be available on Citizens Institute for Rural Design's website following the webinar. Today's webcast is in listen-only mode. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box in the lower right side of your screen. You are also able to turn on live captions and subtitles by selecting Captions and Subtitles on the video controls. My name is Evelyn Immonen, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. Next slide. This webinar is presented by the Citizens Institute on Leadership on Rural Design. The Citizens Institute on Rural Design is a leadership initiative of the National Endowment for the Arts in collaboration with HACC and Building Community Workshop. The Housing Assistance Council, known as HACC, is a national nonprofit focused on communities across rural America through investment and assistance with affordable housing and community and economic development initiatives. Building Communities Workshop is a nonprofit community design firm that works with communities across the country to elevate their strengths and help address their needs through design. Next slide, please. Welcome to CIRD in the time of COVID. This is our second in a rural design webinar series, and we put this together because we heard so many questions and so many stories from our constituents about wanting to reach out to other rural communities and how to respond to this trying time and the global pandemic that we're all affected by. This global pandemic has affected nearly every aspect of our lives, including design and the elements of community engagement and the built environment that we all work on in our everyday lives. For Citizens Institute on Rural Design, all of our partners have been working from home, and we've been able to continue our remote engagement with a learning cohort and had some delays in all of our workshops. So we are currently working to switch to virtual community engagement strategies or practicing safe, socially distanced in-person workshops later on this summer. We look forward to sharing with you our lessons learned from these strategies in the future. Next slide, please. I'm so excited to bring to you today an exciting lineup of all of our presenters. These folks have been working in rural areas in community designs, working on Main Street, and working with the Citizens Institute on Rural Design for a long time. So they are all here to talk with you about their communities and the lessons learned during this global pandemic. Everyone wants to know what to do, what the solutions are, and I think it's important to acknowledge that there are no definite solutions in this time of uncertainty for all of us. But what we can do is offer hope and inspiration from others who are continuing their valuable work. Next slide, please. I am pleased to open us up with a special guest message. This will be from Congressman Shelley Pingree. She is from North Haven, Maine, and after serving 4 terms in the Maine Senate, now serves in the House of Representatives, where she co-chairs the Art Caucus. So please stay tuned for a video message from Congressman Pingree.
Hi, I'm Congresswoman Shelley Pingree. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you a few minutes over a video screen. I'm sorry that the workshop plan for Millinocket wasn't able to move forward, but I hope and assume that will happen again somewhere in our near future. Rural economic development could be really challenged by what we're experiencing with COVID-19, and the role that you play will be even more important. For programs like the Citizens Institute in Rural Design to provide the opportunities that you do to rural communities to revision themselves, for them to have access to your design, planning, creative placemaking professionals, put them in a room together and bring a diverse segment of the community together and then come out with a real plan is an amazing experience and a great opportunity, and we're going to need you more in the future than we've ever needed you before. I live in a rural part of Maine, and I've lived here for nearly 50 years, and I've seen some amazing transformations of communities that have had to change and think about the future. I live near Rockland, Maine, and Rockland was a manufacturing city. It was a fishing town, a fish processing town, and as those things gradually died out, the community had a beautiful brick Main Street with a lot of empty buildings. And it managed to revision itself and move into the future and be something related, but not exactly the same as what it was. It's still a fishing town, but now it has multiple galleries on the main street and shops, restaurants that have been attracted because of that, 2 museums, you know, new places to stay. It's just really a major transformation in a place that people want to come and visit and live, send their kids to school. And so it's great to see how that can change. And now during the COVID-19, they just recently decided to block off the main street so that stores and restaurants could open up and flow into the main street, making it safer for people to visit. And it'll be fascinating to see what they think about themselves going into the future, how this unexpected experience may transform them once again. I was also thinking about Waterville, Maine, the home of Colby College. It also lost a lot of the manufacturing business. It had a dying Main Street. And then Colby College decided to invest some of the funds that were available to them because of their sizable endowment and work to transform the economic development in that community and the Main Street. They bought an old bank and turned it into a business center. They built one of their dorms on the Main Street, bringing students down to eat and to shop and to live. They're building a boutique hotel so people can come there and stay. And they've taken a historic arts center, an opera house, and they're turning it into a modern structure combined with a historic one that will attract people. It will just change the whole view of the community. And I'm so excited in many of these models that the arts play an important role, that we understand that arts can be a vital economic engine. I'm very proud to be the co-chair of the Arts Caucus. I'm thrilled that we were able to secure $75 million additional dollars for the NEA in the CARES package and asked for another in our more $10 million in a more recent package, but it's part of the understanding that the arts are vital, that they're suffering, arts organizations and people who work in that industry are really suffering during this challenging time, and we need to do all we can to support them. But I thank you for the work that you're doing. I know that the work you do will be even more important as we see our way out of this extremely challenging experience our country is attempting to survive, and we thank you for the great work you do. Hi.
Thank you so much. Once again, that was Congresswoman Shelley Pingree. She mentioned in her slide that she's the chair of the Arts Caucus, and Citizens Institute for Rural Design is so grateful for her work as she was instrumental in securing the additional $75 million for the National Endowment for the Arts, and that's going to support arts organizations around the country and keep them afloat during this time. So next we have our first presenter. Manuel Ochoa is the principal founder of the Ochoa Urban Collaborative, and he's worked on different Main Street initiatives and worked with CIRD and rural communities. And welcome, Manuel. Welcome. I think that you're on mute. Yep. All right.
Thank you.
Turn it over to you.
Great. All right, well, we'll get started, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in the webinar today. I know many of you were in touch several months ago, and things have sure changed. So, but glad to be here with you and to share some of our thoughts, some of my thoughts, and rethinking and redesigning downtown. Next slide, please. And we'll just go through the next few slides, the pictures like one by one. And what I wanted to show is just start out with what downtowns used to be. You know, some of these images that we had only a few months ago of our experiences downtown and what we think of as good urban places and good design. Next slide. And how we congregated together and sat together. Next slide. And perhaps some of the places that we reworked, empty lots that we remade into spaces with containers for food and gathering. Next slide. And so now, of course, things it's a very different world that we're in. And rather than sharing with you just ideas about reworking urban places, what I thought is just kind of put everything into context. And so I wanted to share with you a recent report, or just a few figures from the COVID-19 small business report that the National Main Street Center did of main streets across the country. Next slide. And as you might have heard, this came out in the past day or two, and this was a study that was conducted by the University of Chicago, Harvard, University of Illinois, that at least 100,000 businesses have closed for good in the pandemic. And specifically from the National Main Street Center survey, of the 30 million small businesses, nearly 7.5 million small businesses are at risk of closing permanently over the next 3 months. And 3.5 million are at risk of closure in the next 2 months. Approximately, the numbers of unemployment keep going up, and we've had approximately 35.7 million Americans employed by small businesses that could be at risk of becoming unemployed. Next slide. But some of these businesses, over 58% of them have a lease, and over 38% of them own. Most of the small businesses in main streets are 5 or less employees, about 66%. And surprisingly, 63% of the businesses surveyed do not have an online sales presence. But you can see as well that those that do have an online sales portal, so far during the pandemic, 38% of them report that 25% of their sales have come from that portal. Next slide. So among all this bad news that I'm giving you, that we're all reading every day, we will survive this. But downtowns will look very different, and we will get through this together. Next slide. So I thought this was a good one. I don't know if you all saw this in the news. This is from Ocean City, Maryland, and they reopened. And as you can, this is a one bar in Ocean City, and this is their way of doing a little bit of social distancing. Next slide. And we're just really going to have to rethink about how we look at our spaces, not just on the outside, but also on the inside. And on the left is a store called the Brass Knob, which recently closed in DC. And the right is one of my favorite bookstores in Portland, Powell's. But we have bookstores all over the country. And so it's hard to kind of tell how we will shift, from based on consumer behavior and how people will feel in these spaces. These spaces are meant to be experienced in this way, but how are they going to change? And maybe people will still feel comfortable in a small store if there is a few number of people versus a large number of people in a crowded place. Next slide. And of course, we have places where we have things made by hand, maker spaces. Next slide. And we have unique businesses and unique storefronts like this one in Seattle. Next slide. And some of these places that you can't find any place else, like the Gum Wall, which some of you might have seen before. It's pretty gross, but pretty unique and can only be found in a downtown. Next slide. And of course, murals that speak to our community. Next slide. And also how we gather. Next slide. And so as we think about it, many of you are participating in a Main Street program or are doing Main Street-like work. And Main Street has been working since 1980, and it was actually founded because of what was happening with shopping malls that were draining small businesses from the downtown. Next slide. And the Main Street program and downtowns not only survived the mall and the shopping mall, but they also survived big box retail when that became popular in the 90s. the Great Recession in 2008, and then more recently with the success of downtowns, we've seen a lot of the shopping mall conversions into town centers that mimic Main Street, and that has also been another competitive factor, but yet Main Streets have survived and thrived. Next slide. And just as a quick reminder, you know, the four points of Main Street: design, promotion, organization, and economic vitality. Next slide. And so what I wanted to talk to you about really today, if there is one big takeaway about how we think about all this, is how we approach our work. And this was something that I saw recently, not too long ago, from Jill Schlesinger on CBS. She does a section on CBS on money, and she talked about how small businesses are going to transform. Triage, so think about how you do your work. This first phase that we're in is really the triage phase, where, you know, small businesses and a lot of you have just been really busy to just not able to focus on much, but kind of keep, you know, keep the patient from keeping the patient in the ICU and trying to treat the small businesses and all the work that you're doing, and really just have been really just trying to provide the immediate help and information for the PPP program or what have you. But as we move into the next phase, which is the transition, this is where I think a lot of these, where we have to give a little bit more thought about how we reopen downtown. And I know many of you across the country, depending on the state, you all are already going from the triage phase to the transition phase. And then hopefully we will move into the transformation phase, where we can think more comprehensively about what our downtowns may look like. Next slide. So as we think about that, I wanted to, this one of my biggest takeaways that I want to leave behind for all of you, even though we're, you know, it is this Institute on Community on Design, that on rural design, not to just think of the design aspects of just the outside of our buildings or our public spaces or murals or some of those things, but also think about what is happening on the inside. What is going to be that customer experience inside the store, leading, you know, how they're going to approach the retail store or approach the downtown. All of those things also have a design element involved in that. Next slide. So whether it's street festivals or branding, or in this case, rebranding or image building, those are all going to have design aspects that you all should consider. Next slide. And, you know, here's an example of a storefront. You know, how is that going to work? Is this going to be, you know, the kind of store that is still going to be inviting? Or is this something that people aren't going to feel comfortable with? And what I would say to you is, one of the suggestions that I have is to make sure that you have a survey of your local businesses and not only the local businesses, but also the local population, to see about how people's comfort level is on returning to downtown, entering storefronts, and what they think should be, what their customer experience should be like. Next slide. So again, thinking about that design element to bring back people to downtown. Next slide. And thinking more long-term as well about how you keep those legacy businesses. So are there policies that your downtown or your community has been considering, whether it's some kind of a tax incentive, or some kind of grant support to keep some of those businesses afloat that have been around for a long time? Because these places are not only just part of the economic engine, but also part of the identity of the community, and they play an important role in how the community sees itself. Next slide. And, you know, what are those community gathering spaces? So we've seen that here in the DC area, the farmers market, you know, how that operates. You know, the farmers market as it operated only a few months ago is now looking very different, but yet they are important places that help local farmers and bring the community together. So also thinking about how that's designed, what that looks like, what the signage looks like, what the spacing looks like, where you orient people in and out of a space. All those things are going to be very important. Next slide. And I'll share with you, before I talk about just the transformation strategy, recently, one of the examples that I saw in here in DC, the Barracks Row Main Street had a porch happy hour, which was very successful. So they had people outside, and people took their music and sat on the porch. And meanwhile, the stores had entertainment inside, and they had specials that were running, and they actually had a almost like a bingo game. It was like a bingo game where if you virtually entered the store, you would be eligible for a prize, and that was very successful, and it got the community outside. So I live near Northwest DC, over the border in Chevy Chase, Maryland. So I thought, wouldn't it be a great idea to do a porch happy hour here? So we tried that with our community group, and it was a big bust. So I'm telling you this story because we're going to experiment. We're going to try different things, and what may work in one community may not work in another community, even if it's across town. So I think we're just going to go through a period of experimentation, but also don't be afraid of taking your cues or copying from other communities. So as we move into that transition phase, I think we can also think more comprehensively and big picture, and look at how our communities might transform. What is our downtown going to look like in the future? And thinking about that transformation strategy. So you may want to revisit, if you were a arts and entertainment community in the past, is that something that is still right for you based on what's happening economically in the region, or recreation? And if it's still right, how do you tweak that given the new reality? I do think that downtowns too will be back, but it's just going to take, I think, a few months, if not a few years, to see what everything looks like. So I think it'll be a period of trial and error. So really being in touch and working comprehensively in the community is going to be really key for having a successful strategy. Next slide. Next slide. And so some examples were that farmers market that I mentioned, and we've seen how, and you'll be able to find examples of what farmers markets are doing to reorient and gather places, and creating, using guidance from their public health officials, and implementing signage and trying to foster crowd control, and of course the all-important masks and all those other guidances that we now have to do and will be doing over the next few months. Next slide. And you can get really creative. So as you can see there on the left is an example from Rochester, where they're using a branding on their masks to help foster downtown, and creating. And then here's another example of a Main Street News that you can distribute electronically, and give some merchants, resources and ideas. Next slide. And some signage that's available about encouraging people to shop local. Next slide. And one resource that I would suggest is the American Independent Merchants Association, AMIBA Business Alliance, Independent Business Alliance. And they're a great resource on buying local. They have some free templates that are available, like this one that you can use, and some others. Next slide. And some examples also from two communities. Next slide, please. In Harrisonburg, which you saw earlier, they just received a grant from the National Main Street Center to engage in a program called Bricks and Clicks. and they're going to be training their downtown businesses on how to use online portal for sales and other digital enhancements to boost their identity and their e-commerce. So that's one of the things that they're engaging in. Next slide. And then the Niles Main Street program is also trying to tell all the stories that they've collected, and they're rebranding and reorganizing their website to attract more people, have new promotional materials, posters, and window clings for their participating businesses, and car window designs and things like that. So they're again trying to refresh and rebrand their image of their downtown. Next slide. And I would encourage you all to visit the National Main Street Center website. They have a chock-a-block of information, including this Planning for Recovery guide, which offers lots of ideas about how to engage with businesses, including topics for some webinars that you can do, since we are socially distancing and currently a lot of downtown managers aren't able to visit in person, but they're doing things over the phone or virtually. Next slide. And there are also some tips that are available as well, some helpful tips for community leaders, as well as for stores. So about how to adjust your events and how to engage with the public, and surveying the residents, as I mentioned. Next slide. And there are also some worksheets that you can use as now that you may be moving from the period of trying to find that immediate assistance to your small businesses from the PPP program or other state and local programs. You all should pull out your action plans and revisit them and look at it from a post-pandemic frame of mind, and trying to see how you might reorganize or reprioritize what you're doing. Next slide. And so I would encourage you all to think about what you are going to do over the next 3 months, and taking that forward and providing some tools and metrics, and organizing that using the Main Street 4-point approach. That's always helpful. Next slide. And also a few resources just to mention here. Next slide, please. One organization that I've been working with, it's called AntAccess. They've created this free guide called Brick and Mortar, and it is a step-by-step guide on how to reopen your store. And they have some really good advice and expertise, everything from everything related to PPE for stores, or some considerations for your employees, as well as how to reorganize, and some ideas for visual merchandising. This is a really good resource. Next slide. And another resource that I really like is called Street Sense, and they also have lots of great ideas. They've been blogging about COVID-19 recovery, and they have created this hotel survival guide, which might be useful for those small independently owned hotels in your community that are thinking about how to reopen. This is another good guide. Next slide. And so that's it. So thank you very much, and I will be happy to answer questions after we've all spoken, and I'm going to turn it over to Margie to give her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. This is Margie Reese. I'm coming to you from Wichita Falls, Texas, which is a small rural community that serves as a regional hub for about 16 other even smaller communities in our region. And so just wanted to share with you a little bit about the work we've been doing with our neighbors. Next slide, please. And talk a little bit about how we take the real authentic story of our communities and help elevate those so that we can create some visual imagery that can, spark a little bit of life. What you see here are a couple of projects pre-COVID, but still very important to this conversation, where we worked with our small museums in the area. And in Texas, the unique thing about Texas is that the Texas state legislature requires that every county in Texas has a historical society, and such a rich resource in those tiny museums that are mostly volunteer managed. The top right, you'll see this dome-shaped structure, which we learned was the typical housing of the Wichita Nation that was in our community, before we moved them to Oklahoma. I don't say that lightly. And then below that is an image of a very contemporary design that an artist was inspired to create as a result of doing research on the Wichita Nation Dome. The centerpieces, the top of that center, is an abandoned gas station that had been an eyesore in that community for a number of years. And so with the help of a team of very wonderful young university student artists, recreated and turned that space into a lively music box looking space to enliven that neighborhood again. And then the final slide, the one all the way to the left, is a project that we did called Don't Fence Me In, a tribute to a very important Western song. And we asked the neighbors in this small community, who all said that they're not artists. They don't do art. So we collected pickets, used pickets from fence material, and invited the community to paint just on one canvas, one picket, their own story, their own ideas. We thought we'd get about 100 to 200 of these pickets. We ended up with 1,200. And it just goes to show you how a small idea in a community, when you ask people to tell their story or to react to history, what they will come up with and how that changes. And we don't consider these projects to be public art projects. These are projects that have resulted in art in public spaces. But the Don't Fence Me In project, the gas station, and then the Wichita Dome are just a few examples of how low-level work, low-hanging fruit kind of work, can result in major shifts and changes in a community. Next slide. I suppose the most important thing I wanted to talk to you about is our approach, both pre and as we are entering into this COVID phase now. This whole process of thinking about design in rural communities has to first of all be executed with a lot of patience. And so we spend a lot of time trying to understand the community perspective, to empathize with those neighbors who are suffering a great deal of loss, to empathize with their storytelling, and then to define together what we're going to work on. What are the challenges that we're trying to address? I think this is a really important piece, and I hope you'll take this slide to heart, because sometimes we enter these arenas with a predetermined set of practices, with a textbook case of, here's how we're going to come in and help you. And rural communities rebel against that idea. We need to create ideas with those neighbors in a very patient way. We need to show them, which is why I'm showing you the slides that the images in the previous slide. Show them what we're thinking about. Show them how we have taken their ideas and what could that look like. Because we're using language that's familiar to our industry, to the arts management, to urban design, and that language may not be familiar with our neighbors, familiar to them. So we just show them a little bit of what we're thinking about, test the idea, create some small projects to have them relate to, and then implement those. And that leads us to that left side of this slide that says, deliver on your promise. Even in this time of COVID-19 and uncertainty, Our smaller communities are reading the newspapers just like anyone else. They're concerned about what's happening across the country. But for many of our communities, they get left behind. By the time they get information, understand the application process, funding has been depleted, or their timing is too late. So we have to create systems that allow us to deliver on our promise when we're working in these small communities. Next slide. And I think this is actually just to tell you that our communities are so different. You'll see on the left, neighbors working together on the pickets. And the centerpiece are our neighbors working on the dome. And the photograph at the bottom of that is a photograph of the Navy Seabees that are stationed at the Shepherd Air Force Base in our community. We do everything we can not to just use the airmen and women as day laborers, but to involve them in design, to helping us think about how do we create the scaffolding that can hold the artwork that we're interested in. So we're using their engineering skills. And so when we bring these men and women to a neighborhood meeting, the community respects the Air Force. They respect the base. They understand that that's a huge part of our regional economy. And so these young people are in our community for 2 years at most. They're able to get involved in the community, and our neighbors are able to use their expertise. And then that final row of slides, the gentleman in the white hat and me in the black hat, I'm not the bad guy, but the gentleman in the white hat owns every kind of auto dealership in town you can imagine. He's suffering greatly right now. His businesses, are not as lucrative for many reasons, as you can imagine. But getting him involved in the thing that he loves, which is cattle ranching, and becoming familiar with the things that he cares about, so that that can be a starting point for us to think about how we can help restore and encourage survival of his businesses. And then the hams at the bottom of that page are volunteers again, a couple of theater people and a symphony person, but trying to reach across the community. Most of our arts organizations are community arts organizations. They're not the fine art theaters that you might see in many urban cities. But how can we involve the creatives in thinking about how we restore dignity as we go through this COVID-19 process? Talented young people throughout. Next slide. And this just goes to show you we've done a series of murals in our city, and these 3 images showcase are the remnants of a huge grain elevator which was owned by General Mills 100 years ago. The central slide, the middle slide, is a storage area where they stored the grain, and then the last slide is what it looks like today. So we're working with our community to think about how we can show resilience and resurgence during this process. So we're commissioning a team of local graffiti artists to create images inside and outside of this structure. It's been an eyesore for about 5 decades in the community, and now we think it's time to use that eyesore as sort of a rebuilding, a phoenix rising, if you will, to help our neighbors see that we appreciate the grit and the determination that they have if they can withstand as much time as we have seen in the last few months. But I think that I just wanted to scan and show you a little bit about what's happening in some of the communities that we work in. Next slide, I think this may be my last one. I want to introduce Megan, and we can take questions later. But I want to introduce Megan, who is going to talk to you about her work. Megan?
Thank you, Margie. My name is Megan Untitled, and I'm the Executive Director. If you want to flip to the next slide. City is a community development organization, and we work primarily with communities under populations of 500. So North Dakota, even though we are a relatively small state in terms of population, about 750,000 in terms of that population, We are geographically large, and of our approximately 300 communities, 80% of those are below populations of 500. Additionally, North Dakota, we are able to work well with our 5 Native nations that share our same geography, and they add a tremendous amount to the type of art and culture that we're able to offer here in North Dakota. Next slide. So in addition to COVID-19 and our business community really shutting down, we as a state are also contending with the downfall of one of our primary economic drivers, being the oil and gas industry, even going so far as to have the price of a barrel of oil trading negatively on April 25th. So in addition to the levels of unemployment related with COVID-19, we're also seeing huge levels of unemployment when it comes to the oil and gas industry. Next slide. So when we're looking across North Dakota and continuing to maintain relationships and do that great community work with all of our small towns, what we think that small towns need right now is really to remember who they are. All the good parts, even the bad parts, and even those kind of middle or neutral parts. Rigorous and honest self-appraisal will be the key to resilience. It will provide that strong foundation that your community can build upon. And as organizations, whether we're arts and culture, community development, economic development, or any other type of service provider, we need to remember to keep the community at the center of our work. And being able to better pivot to support the community will assure that we can develop great fundraising messages or even stave off staff burnout. Next slide, please. And rural design really fits into the larger scheme or into the larger picture of resilience across our nation, because COVID-19 has given us an opportunity to really see our communities through new eyes. We can better look at what assets exist outside of typical gathering points like restaurants, bars, or traditional events. We can look at those historical, art, recreation, or other aesthetic pieces that add vibrancy to our community. So the challenge to us will be, how can we utilize what we're experiencing or learning through this period of social distancing to really make a case to our elected officials, our donors, our grant makers, or even to the community at large, so that we can support them to make design a priority. Next slide, please. And as we're continuing that work and with the work that we've done in the past, I think some of the lessons that we're learning throughout the pandemic is that this is an opportunity to grow. We as an organization are trying to utilize this time as an opportunity to deepen our commitment to our cause. Never has there been a greater time to engage in community development, or to engage in economic development, or to support the well-being of our friends and neighbors through arts and culture. We're also utilizing this time to reevaluate partnership opportunities. How can we better work together? With the limited funds that we have available and the need to streamline operations and look at new funding streams, there are a myriad of opportunities that we can leverage within our communities or across our states to make our work more effective and to make it more efficient. We're also utilizing this time to interface differently and support differently our staff, trying to be thoughtful about flexibility in hours, really practicing grace, and taking what we're calling a whole employee approach. I think we've always been able to be thoughtful and supported other communities and other organizations to be thoughtful about trying to meet needs of employees outside of the business environment, but never has there been a more important time, or perhaps a more heightened time, to really think about that whole employee approach than right now. And also we're trying to selfishly, as we're looking to grow, scouting the talent pool to see how we can best invest in our organization's future. Unfortunately, as Manuel pointed out earlier, not all businesses will survive this pandemic, and there are going to be tremendously talented people both within the nonprofit and arts and culture sector, as well as in the private sector, that will have a greater desire to give back to their community and can really add to the overall effectiveness of any organization. So again, keeping the community at center. We are glass half full folks here in North Dakota and within our organization. So we are trying very, very hard to dig deep and think about how we can utilize this as a foundation to grow forward. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about the advice that we would give to communities across the country or even within North Dakota, we know this is tough. It's going to take years for our communities and our economy to fully recover, but we are resilient people and we can do it. And one of our favorite sayings is, worry about everything, panic about nothing. We as leaders within the sector have to be thoughtful about the changes economically, the changes socially that are impacting our organizations, but we just have to try to anticipate and shift to better accommodate the needs of our community, to better be more effective rather with our organization and the types of services that we provide. But it's important that we don't panic, right? We have to keep our wits about us, take care of ourselves, take care of our teams, keep our community at the center of our work, and really just do the best that we can. Everyone is under stress right now. Everybody is full of worry, but all we can do is our best, and we have to take care of ourselves and of our sector because we really are that vibrant piece throughout our country. So Evelyn, I'll turn it back over to you. That is all I have in terms of the slides. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Megan. Thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Margie. This has been so interesting and so enlightening and inspiring to hear all of your guys' story. We have a few questions in the chat box already, but just a reminder to all presenters tuning in, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A section of your presentation. We have a question for Margie. It is from someone who is a rural-based architectural designer in southern Minnesota. She says that she loves hearing about your work in the communities and the arts and your emphasis on listening to rural communities before designing for them. My question is, have you used architects in projects that you could share? And if not, how do you think artists and architects can work together on projects such as housing and community centers with rural communities in mind?
Well, thank you for that question, and I absolutely do believe that artists and architects are joined at the hip. We have worked with 2 different architectural firms. Actually, one advised us was a really great informer to the Dome project, looking at the history of that particular nation's architecture and then helping the creative team bring that forward. But also, as we're looking at the slide that you saw of the 50-year-old building, we're also looking at how we can enhance that property by making some additions inside the structure. I have to say that we cheat a little bit because one of our board members is an architect, a local architect, and another is a structural engineer. So I think that having both of those resources on our board and constantly a part of the conversation is really helpful. Architects are a little bit more rigid sometimes, and we appreciate that because they can warn us and help us think through as we talk to the community how to sustain integrity, how to sustain the historical integrity of place. But then also we have to have the creative so they can push the envelope a little bit.
Sorry, thank you so much. We have another question from a participant who is asking either Margie or Megan for the on-the-ground perspective, how have funders been responding to this? Have they been stepping up or have they been stepping away?
I'll just quickly say that funders in rural community are not, they don't consider themselves to be funders. They are partners. And so we approach them early on in the process so that they can see the ideation happening. I think our small foundations and businesses in rural communities want to see their communities grow, but they also want to know that you're approaching a project from the inside out, from the community perspective out. And so we like to involve our partners as early on in the conversations as possible. And yes, they do step up.
I would agree with Margie. Funders have been one thing that is a bit of a challenge, and this is speaking specifically for North Dakota, is that we don't have a great number of funders that really do participate across our state. So a lot of the funders that we have are very localized and smaller dollars. So we support a few different entities with fundraising and grant making, a few family trusts and folks like that. They have been stepping up and investing in communities. We have seen more of those dollars go toward or be focused on, and rightfully so, those immediate community needs: access to food, access to housing, access to transportation to navigate North Dakota, to be able to, get to food pantries, get your immediate needs met, daycares, things like that. So that has been the big push in North Dakota over the last 2 months. I am a bit nervous or worried, I guess would probably be the correct word, around how long the push for immediate needs, funding immediate needs, will happen. Again, it's deserved. Those funds, people need to eat, people need a roof over their head, which is, that's something that can't be disputed. I'm nervous about, as we look long term, what will be the availability for design, arts and culture, or even community development projects in years to come, because a lot of, again, funding is being focused toward those immediate needs. But I would put that back on us as a sector, that we need to be able to better communicate, or again, really look at our communities and say, why is it that this project is needed? A lot of us know intrinsically that it's needed, but we need to be better with our approach to funders or grant makers around why this adds to quality of life. We need to very much tighten up our grant language, our individual donor meeting language to better reflect that, because I think the I hate to use the word competition, I think that's the wrong word, but I think the demand for funds is going to continue to be high for the next 18 to 24 months.
Very well said, Megan. Yes, and as a nonprofit ourselves, Housing Assistance Council is in a similar position, and as I'm sure a lot of people on the call are, but we're in this together to some degree. Another reminder for everyone, if they want to have a chance to submit another question, you can do so in the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner. We have one question that's asking about advice to keep the momentum going around design or arts projects during this time. And have we witnessed any local successes in this space? Manuel, what would you say about that? Is there momentum going on?
I mean, what I would say, one of the takeaways that I hope people can get is, yes, certainly architects, but, interior designers, graphic designers, and those that work in those arts related fields are going to be very key in moving forward. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there already. And I think there's a lot of creativity already going on. So I think there's a lot of movement from those fields and trying to help in the pandemic response.
Great, awesome. Thank you guys, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to see if we get any last questions in, but I think this has been such a good group to work with. And thank you also to Congresswoman Pingree and her staff for working with us to share a message from the perspective of a national legislator. There's been so much happening in the last couple of months. Not all of it bad, though, as we can see from these presentations. So it's been a pleasure to work with you guys. The Citizens Institute on Rural Design is always looking for new ways to connect rural communities to resources and toolkits in the arts and in design. And we have one last question, freebie for any of the presenters. Final thoughts on how to do community engagement at this time. Are rural areas ready for community engagement right now?
I would say to think about the three, triage, transition, and transformation as your bywords for how you engage with the community. As I mentioned earlier, every community is going to be different. So if you see that small businesses are pressed or community organizations are pressed, that wouldn't be the right time to do it. But if they are transitioning and more opening and they're feeling less like, I like that, not to worry but not panic, and if they're transitioning from the panic to the worry, then that's a good place to start.
Megan? Yeah, we can't hear you. Sorry.
Can you hear me now? Evelyn, are you able to hear me now?
Yes, we are.
Okay, sorry about that. I would agree with Manuel. I think there will be times where people will be incredibly excited to engage. And I think that we can look at how maybe we do it differently. Instead of holding a town hall where people can come and voice their opinions, do we go the old school method and put a postcard out where people can write their thoughts and mail it back in? Can we set up some chalkboards in our downtown or along our walking paths and pose a question? I think there are ways to engage the community that are quote unquote offline, but I think people are hungry to engage and support their communities to be better because they're all seeing the importance really of community at this time. So I think that there are some great ways that we can do community engagement. It's just going to look a little bit differently.
Well said. Thank you. Yes, I would say let's focus on ways to reach out to our community, look at what that word means and how it's transformed so much in all of our lives over the last few months. Thank you everybody for joining us. This is the end of our time here. The recording for this webinar will be posted on our website soon, and you can subscribe to our newsletter to get notification about other opportunities like this webinar series. Thanks to all of our presenters and have a great rest of your afternoon.